General Richard Hale grabbed the Barrett .50 cal straight out of her hands and slammed it down on the metal table so hard the entire armory shook. "Who the hell authorized you to touch this weapon, soldier?" Every person in that room stopped breathing. Marinox, 22 years old, barely reaching his shoulder, did not step back, did not blink. She looked straight at the two-star general who had just put his hands on a classified asset and said quietly without flinching, "I authorized myself, sir." Hale's jaw tightened. His hand was still on the rifle. She hadn't moved an inch. If you're new here, subscribe right now and drop your city in the comments. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Stay with me until the very end. You will not believe where this goes. The morning had started like every other morning at Iron Cliff Base. Cold, gray, the kind of early that makes your joints ache before you've even had coffee. The kind of morning where the mountains around the base look like they're leaning in, watching, waiting for something to happen. General Richard Hale walked with the particular gravity of a man who had spent 32 years earning the right to walk that way. His boots hit the pavement with a rhythm that everyone on base had learned to recognize. Staff, subordinates, even colonels. When they heard those footsteps in the corridor, they straightened, not because they were ordered to, because something in the sound of it demanded it. Hale was not a cruel man, let that be clear from the start. He was not a bully. He was not the kind of general who ruled through fear or humiliation. He was the kind of general who had led men into places that don't appear on any map, who had written letters to families that no one should ever have to write, who had carried the weight of command for so long that it had become structural, part of his spine, part of his jaw, part of the way his eyes moved when he entered a room. He saw everything. That was his gift. And on this particular Tuesday morning, it was the thing that started all of it. He was passing Armory Building 7 on a routine inspection walk. He had not planned to stop. His schedule had him at the officer's briefing at 0800, and he was already running 4 minutes behind, which for Richard Hale was practically a personal catastrophe. He did not run behind. He did not do late. Late was sloppy. Late was disrespect dressed up as an accident. But he stopped. He stopped because through the half-open door of Armory 7, he saw something that didn't belong. A young woman, small frame, dark hair pulled back so tight it looked painted on, and in her hands cradled with the kind of familiarity that takes years to develop. The kind you don't fake was a Barrett M82A1, 50 caliber, anti-material rifle, one of the most powerful, most restricted weapons in the American military inventory. Hale stopped walking. His aide, Lieutenant Gary Fetch, 26 years old, fresh-faced, perpetually nervous in the way that only people who work directly for generals understand, nearly walked into his back. "Sir." Hale didn't answer. He was watching the woman through the gap in the door. She was running a function check on the Barrett, not rushing, not showing off, just doing it methodical, precise, the way a surgeon checks instruments before an operation. Her hands moved like they had done this 10,000 times. Maybe they had. Hale pushed the door open. The sound of it swinging hit the room before he did, and every head turned. 2 male technicians near the back wall, 1 specialist checking ammunition logs by the far shelf, and the young woman with the Barrett who turned her head, not her whole body, just her head, and looked at him. She looked at him the way you look at someone you expected to show up eventually. "General on deck," someone called out, and the room snapped to attention. Everyone except the woman who set the Barrett down on the inspection table with careful, deliberate hands and then stood at attention herself, correct, straight, regulation, but without the urgency, without the scramble, like she had simply decided to stop what she was doing and stand up, and the timing of his entrance was incidental. That bothered him. He filed it away. "At ease," he said, stepping into the room. His eyes were already moving, cataloging, sorting, noting. The Barrett on the table, the opened casing beside it, the tools arranged with unusual precision. Then he looked at her rank, staff sergeant, then at the small badge on her sleeve, matte black, compact, the kind of insignia you had to look for. He didn't recognize it. He almost didn't catch it, but he caught it, and something about it made the air in the room feel different. "Staff Sergeant," he said. "Sir," she said, "who authorized access to the M82A1? A beat. 1 single beat of silence. Not long enough to be disrespect. Long enough to be intentional. "I authorized myself, sir." Lieutenant Fetch made a small, strangled sound behind him. One of the male technicians by the wall seemed to stop breathing altogether. The specialist with the ammunition log turned very slowly, like a man who has just heard something he needs to make sure he heard correctly. General Richard Hale, 32 years, 14 commendations. More deployments than he could count on two hands, stood very still. I'm sorry, he said. I authorized my own access to the weapon, sir, Maranox said. Her voice was calm, not defiant in the way that young soldiers sometimes get when they're trying to prove something. Calm in the way that people are when they know something you don't. I hold operational clearance for this class of weapon under a designation that falls outside standard unit authorization protocol. Hale stared at her. What's your name, Staff Sergeant? Knox, sir, Mara Knox. How long have you been stationed at Ironcliff? 3 weeks, sir. And in 3 weeks you have decided that you have the authority to pull a restricted asset without unit commander approval. I have that authority, sir, in writing. He looked at Fetch. Pull her records. Fetch already had his tablet out. He was good at anticipating things, which was why Hale kept him around despite the nervousness. He pulled up the personnel database, typed in the name, waited. And then his face did something that Hale had never quite seen it do before. It went blank. Sir, Fetch said carefully, her file is restricted. Everything is restricted to some degree, Fetch. Pull what you can. Sir, I mean, her file is almost entirely redacted. Name, rank, serial number. Current station, that's all I have. Everything else is blacked out. Service history, training records, deployment history, commendations, all of it. There's a classification marker on the file I don't have a code for. Silence. Hale looked at Knox. Knox looked back at him. She had the particular stillness of someone who has waited out much harder things than this. What classification marker? Hale said. It's Fetch squinted at the screen. I've never seen this one before, sir. It's not a standard DoD designation. Hale took a slow breath. He had been in the Army since before this woman was born. He had held security clearances that most generals never see. He had walked through the classified architecture of half a dozen covert programs and not blinked. And he was standing in front of a 22-year-old staff sergeant whose file he could not read. Knox, he said, and his voice had dropped, not softer exactly, but lower, the way voices go when a conversation has shifted from procedural to serious. What is on that badge? She glanced down at her sleeve, then back up at him. That's classified, sir. Knox. Sir, with respect, the badge, what it represents, and the authority it confers are all classified at a level that I'm not authorized to discuss without a secure environment in confirmation of your clearance level for that specific program. She paused. I don't mean that as disrespect. I mean it exactly as I said it. Captain David Morris had appeared in the doorway behind Fetch. Morris ran the day-to-day logistics of Armory Building 7 and 3 others on this end of the base. He was a solid officer, competent, fair, the kind of man who did his job without drama. He was also at this exact moment looking at the scene in front of him with the expression of a man watching a car crash in slow motion, unable to look away and unable to stop it. Morris, Hale said without turning around. Did you authorize this access? No, sir, Morris said immediately. I was not aware she was in here until just now. So a staff sergeant you didn't authorize walked into your armory and pulled a restricted asset. Morris opened his mouth, then closed it. Then with visible difficulty, that appears to be the case, sir. Hale turned back to Knox. You understand how this looks? Yes, sir. You understand that regardless of whatever clearance you may or may not hold operating outside of chain of command, notification is a serious breach of protocol. Sir, my operational parameters specifically exempt me from standard chain of command notification in certain circumstances. Accessing equipment for maintenance evaluation is one of those circumstances. Maintenance evaluation, Hale repeated. The M82A1 currently in inventory here has a scope mount that is 17 microns out of tolerance. I noticed it yesterday during an inventory walkthrough. It would not be detectable in a standard inspection, but it would affect long-range accuracy at distances over 1,800 meters. I came in this morning to document it and recommend replacement. That is the entirety of my purpose here, sir. Fetch looked up from his tablet. He was staring at Knox with undisguised fascination. Hale looked at the Barrett, then he looked at Knox. 17 microns. Yes, sir. You noticed a 17 micron tolerance deviation on a scope mount during a walkthrough. Yes, sir. Without instruments? A brief pause. I have very good eyes, sir. Something shifted in the room. It was almost imperceptible, the kind of shift you feel before you can name it, like a change in air pressure, like the moment before a storm when the birds go quiet. Morris spoke from this doorway, and his voice had changed to lower, more careful. Sir, if I may, the badge on her sleeve. I've been trying to place it since she came through my section. I've never seen that insignia in 17 years of service. Neither have I, Hale said. He walked closer to Knox. She didn't move. She stood exactly where she was and let him approach, which itself was a kind of confidence. The confidence of someone who has nothing to hide and nothing to prove, and both of those things simultaneously. He looked at the badge, matte black, small. The number 200 was etched into it in simple numerals, followed by the word confirmed. He straightened. The number landed in his chest like a physical thing. He was a combat veteran. He understood what confirmed meant in the context of a sniper's record. He understood what it meant next to a distance. He understood the weight of that number 200 meters and what it implied and why it was impossible and why it was sitting on the sleeve of a 22-year-old staff sergeant in an armory on a base in the middle of nowhere. The current world record for a confirmed sniper kill, which he knew because he had spent enough time around special operations to know things like this, was just over 540 meters set by a Canadian operator. Before that, the record holders had been legends in their communities, names that circulated in quiet rooms among people who understood what those distances meant. 200 meters, confirmed. Knox, he said. His voice was different now. He didn't try to hide it. Where did you earn that? Sir, that information is classified. I'm a 2-star general. Yes, sir, and with respect, your clearance level does not include the program under which that badge was awarded. I'm not saying this to be difficult, sir. I'm saying it because that is the factual situation. Hale looked at her for a long moment. Then he pulled out his own phone and made a call. The room waited. Fetch had stopped pretending to look at his tablet. Morris had stepped fully into the room, now standing near the wall watching. The two technicians had not moved. This is General Hale, he said into the phone. Get me Colonel Greer right now. He hung up and looked at Knox. You're going to stay right here. Yes, sir, she said. She turned and with perfect calm picked up the clipboard she had left on the inspection table. She made a notation on the form. Then she set the clipboard down again and folded her hands and waited, like she had been waiting her whole life and had simply gotten very good at it. Colonel Samuel Greer arrived 11 minutes later. Hale knew this because he had been watching the clock. 11 minutes from the call to the door, which meant Greer had been somewhere on base and had moved quickly, which meant he'd known exactly what the call was going to be about before Hale said more than 2 sentences. That told Hale something. Greer was a lean man, older than his rank suggested he should be, with the particular manner of someone who has spent time in rooms that don't exist on any organizational chart. He walked into Armory 7, looked at Knox, looked at Hale, and did not look surprised by either. General, he said. Colonel Hale said, you want to tell me what's going on with this soldier? Greer looked at Knox again. There was something in his look, not quite deference, not quite the look you give a subordinate, but something in between. Respect, the real kind. Perhaps we could step outside, Sir, Greer said. I'd like to have this conversation right here. A beat. Greer glanced at the other personnel in the room. Morris, Hale said, take your people and wait outside. Morris moved quickly, gathering the 2 technicians, and the door closed behind them. Fetch stayed. Hale trusted Fetch. She's been on my base for 3 weeks. Hale said, his voice measured now, controlled. She pulled a restricted asset without notifying the armory commander. She is wearing an insignia I have never seen in 32 years of service, and her personnel file is blacked out to the point of uselessness. Explain this to me, Sam. Greer took a breath. She is attached to a program I cannot name in any environment without proper security protocol, but I can tell you the broad outline. She operates independently. No unit, no spotter listed in any accessible record, no deployment documentation in the standard system. That is by design, not by accident. She's 22 years old. Yes, sir. And that badge. Greer was quiet for a moment. Verified, sir? 200 meters. Yes, sir. That surpasses, it surpasses official records, yes, by a significant margin. The reason it does not appear in any official record is that the circumstances under which it was achieved cannot be disclosed. Hale turned and looked at Knox. She was standing exactly where she had been standing the whole time, feet shoulder-width apart, hands folded. Not stiff, just steady, like a tree that has been through enough weather that weather doesn't move it anymore. "How old were you?" Hale said to her when that was confirmed. She met his eyes. 19, sir." The word landed in the room and no one did anything with it for several seconds. 19. Fetch made a sound that was not quite a word. He covered it with a cough. Hale turned back to Greer. "I want a demonstration." Greer blinked. "Sir, I want to see it. I want to see what this is." He looked at Knox. "Staff Sergeant, can you replicate the conditions?" Knox did not hesitate. "I need range 4, sir, clear weather, which we have today. The M82A1 currently in inventory once the scope mount is replaced. Time to set up and verify conditions. And the range needs to be extended." "Range 4 only goes to 2,000 meters," Morris said from the door. He had apparently not gone far. "I know," Knox said. "We'll need to extend the target placement to 3,200 if you want an accurate demonstration." Hale looked at Greer. Greer looked at Knox. And for just a moment, just one single moment, something moved across Greer's face that Hale had not expected. It was not pride exactly. It was something older than pride. It was the face of a man watching something extraordinary exist quietly in the world, knowing most people will never understand what they're looking at. "Make the arrangements," Hale said to Fetch. "Yes, sir." He looked at Knox one more time. She was watching him with those calm, steady eyes, not waiting for approval, not nervous, not excited. Just present the way people are when they are completely at home inside themselves, when the outside world, with all its ranks and insignia and protocol, has simply become background noise to something larger and quieter that lives inside them. "Knox," he said. "Sir, that scope mount, how long to get a replacement installed?" 40 minutes, sir, if we have the right mount in inventory." She paused. "We do. Bay 3, shelf 9 second, from the left. I noted it yesterday." He stared at her. She waited. And Richard Hale, a man who had spent 32 years believing he had seen everything the Army could produce, turned and walked out of Armory 7 with the particular feeling of a man who is about to find out that he has been wrong about something fundamental. Not wrong about the Army. Not wrong about service or sacrifice, or what this institution could produce. Wrong about the shape of it, the faces it could wear, the size it could come in, the age, the gender, the quiet way that the most extraordinary things sometimes fold themselves into small spaces and wait patient as mountains for the world to finally stop talking long enough to see them. He walked out into the cold gray morning, and the mountains leaned in watching, and the day continued to unfold like a story that had been written long before any of them walked into that room. Behind him in Armory 7, Mara Knox picked up her clipboard and made another notation, careful and precise, and set it back down. Then she walked to Bay 3, shelf 9, and reached for the second mount from the left. It was exactly where she said it would be. The replacement scope mount took Mara 38 minutes to install, not 40, 38. She didn't announce it. She didn't look up to see if anyone was impressed. She simply set the tool down, ran her fingers along the rail one final time, and said to no one in particular, "It's ready." Fetch had been watching her the entire time from the corner of the armory. He hadn't meant to. He had told himself he was reviewing logistics for range 4 clearance on his tablet, but the truth was he had barely looked at the screen. There was something about the way she worked that was almost impossible not to watch. Not because it was showy, because it wasn't. Every movement connected to the next one without waste, without hesitation, like watching someone who had long ago made peace with the weight of what they were doing and no longer needed to think about it consciously. He caught himself and looked back down at his tablet. General Hale was outside making calls. Fetch could hear the low, controlled cadence of his voice through the wall. Not the words, just the tone. The tone of a man who is methodically pulling on threads and does not yet know what they are attached to. Morris had come back inside. He was standing near the door with his arms folded, watching Knox with an expression that Fetch recognized because he felt it himself. It was the expression of a man recalibrating, quietly, privately, trying not to show it. "Knox," Morris said finally. She looked up. "How long have you been working with the Barrett platform?" She considered the question. Not like she was deciding what to tell him, more like she was deciding how to say something true in a way that would actually land. Long enough, she said. Morris nodded slowly. Right. He unfolded his arms and folded them again. The 200 on your badge. That's meters. Yes, sir. Not yards. No, sir, meters. I was quiet for a moment. Then he said very carefully, as though testing the weight of each word before he committed to it. That's almost 2 miles. Just under 2 miles, sir. 1.988 to be precise. Morris looked at the Barrett on the table. Then he looked at her. Then he looked at the Barrett again. How, he said. It wasn't really a question. It was more like a word that had escaped before he could stop it. Mara almost smiled. It wasn't a full smile. It was the very beginning of one, the kind that comes and goes so quickly you are not sure you saw it. Correctly, she said. General Hale walked back into the armory, and the half-smile vanished. Mara was already standing straight. Range 4 is being cleared, Hale said. He looked at Fetch. What's the status on extending the target placement? Engineering it as a team, moving now, sir. They're placing a steel gong target at 200 meters. Given the terrain there, Fetch consulted his tablet. They're placing it on the north ridgeline using the natural elevation. Wind across that corridor is currently running at about 9 miles per hour from the northwest. Temperature is 41 degrees. Hale looked at Knox. Is that workable? Yes, sir. You're not going to ask for different conditions? No, sir. 9 miles an hour northwest, 41 degrees. I'll account for it. He studied her face for a moment. She gave him nothing to read, not defiance, not nerves, not performance, just steadiness. The kind that isn't practiced because you're trying to project confidence. The kind that exists because somewhere along the way the noise just stopped. Colonel Greer is meeting us at the range, Hale said. We move in 20 minutes. Yes, sir, she said. She was already wrapping the Barrett for transport. The drive to Range 4 took 7 minutes. Nobody talked much. Fetch sat in the front and kept his eyes forward. Morris rode separately. Hale sat in the back with Knox and looked out the window with his jaw set and his hands flat on his thighs. Knox sat with the cased Barrett across her knees and her eyes forward, and her breathing slow and even, the way people breathe when they are already somewhere else in their heads, already at the range, already on the ground, already doing the math. Colonel Greer was waiting when they arrived. He had 2 men with him that nobody introduced and nobody asked about. They stood back near the vehicles and didn't speak, and the way they carried themselves told Fetch everything he needed to know about what kind of soldiers they were. He filed that away too. Sergeant Knox, Greer said by way of greeting. Colonel, she said. That was it. No ceremony. But the weight in those 4 syllables was unmistakable. These two knew each other in a way that had nothing to do with the usual military relationship between a colonel and a staff sergeant. There was history there. Not warm history necessarily, but real history. The kind built in places that don't make it into reports. Hale noticed it immediately. He said nothing. The range was set. Fetch had confirmed the target placement, a 12-inch steel gong on a frame anchored to the ridgeline. From where they were standing, it was completely invisible to the naked eye. Fetch had binoculars. He had confirmed the placement himself before they arrived. He knew it was there. And still looking out across that distance, he could not see it. The idea of hitting it with a rifle, not a guided system, not a drone from this position, felt so far outside the boundaries of what he understood to be physically possible that he had to stop himself from saying so out loud. Mara Knox knelt and opened the case. She did not ask for a mat. She did not ask for a spotting scope. She did not ask for a wind meter or a laser rangefinder, and when Fetch moved to hand her one, she looked at it briefly and shook her head. I have my readings, she said. From what, he asked. From looking at the range, sir, and from the data I already have on this corridor. Hale looked at Greer. Greer said nothing. He was watching Knox. She laid down, flat. The Barrett came up naturally, the stock finding her shoulder like it had always been there, like the rifle and the shooter were one thing that had been temporarily separated and was now reassembled. She made small adjustments to the scope, precise, tiny, the adjustments of someone who has made them so many times that the numbers are not numbers anymore. They are muscle memory. They are instinct, translated into fractions of a degree. Sir, Fetch said quietly, stepping close to Hale. She's not using a spotter. I see that. At this distance, without a spotter, I know what it means, Fetch. A confirmed long-range engagement at distances over 2,000 meters almost always requires 2 people, a shooter and a spotter. The spotter calls when reads mirage tracks, environmental changes in real time, corrects the shooter between rounds. Without a spotter, you are shooting blind in ways that even the most sophisticated optics cannot fully compensate for. At 200 meters, variables compound. Wind doesn't blow in one direction over 2 miles of terrain. It shifts, bends, drops, rises. Temperature layers. Humidity changes. The bullet is in flight for so long that the earth itself rotates measurably beneath it. Without a spotter, Knox was still adjusting the scope. She had not fired yet. She was breathing. Long, slow, deliberate breaths. Utpano. Somebody saw her births. The kind that lower the heart rate, the kind that turn a living body into the steadiest possible platform for a machine designed to place a piece of metal at a point nearly 2 miles away. Hale looked at Morris. Morris was staring down range. Captain, Hale said. Morris turned. Sir, what's your read on this? Morris was quiet for a moment. Then he said something that surprised Hale. Sir, I've been running armories for 8 years. I've had a lot of soldiers come through. Good ones, some great ones. He paused. I've never felt like this watching someone get ready to shoot. How do you feel? Morris thought about it honestly. Like I'm supposed to be quiet, he said. Like something is about to happen that I'm not going to understand right away. Hale looked back at Knox. She had gone still. Not the stillness of someone waiting. The stillness of someone who has already arrived. Her right hand moved barely, just the index finger curling, and the Barrett fired. The sound was immense. Even with hearing protection, the concussion of a .50 caliber round, leaving the barrel at close to 3,000 feet per second, hit the chest like a physical push. Fetch actually stepped back half a step. One of Greer's silent men didn't flinch at all. Morris absorbed it without moving. The bullet was gone. They waited. Long-range shooting is not like what you see in films. There is no instant confirmation. At extreme distances, you fire and then you wait. You wait for the bullet to travel. At 200 meters, a .50 caliber round, traveling at subsonic range speed, will be in the air for several seconds. Several long, silent, impossible seconds, during which you are simply waiting to find out if the math was right, if the red was right, if the shooter was right. 4 seconds. 5. And then faint, clear, unmistakable across 2 miles of cold mountain air, the sound of steel. A ring, high and clean and absolute. Nobody moved for a moment, then Fetch said very quietly, "Oh my God." Morris turned away, not out of disrespect. Fetch would understand later that it was because Morris needed a second to process something that his brain was insisting could not have just happened. Greer stood perfectly still. General Richard Hale stared down range at a target he could not see, which had just been struck by a bullet fired by a 22-year-old staff sergeant using no spotter, no rangefinder, and no hesitation. And he felt something shift in his chest, not dramatically. It wasn't a movie moment. It was quieter than that. It was the specific feeling of a deeply held certainty quietly revising itself. He looked down at Knox. She had not moved from the firing position. Her eye was still at the scope. Her breathing had returned to normal, slow, even as if the shot had cost her nothing at all. "Knox," he said. "Sir, come up." She rose in one smooth motion, the Barrett coming with her, and she stood beside the general and waited. He didn't know what he had planned to say. He found that whatever it wasn't available to him right now. "How many times," he said finally, "have you made a shot like that under operational conditions?" She held his gaze. And for the first time since he had walked into Armory 7 that morning, something moved across her face that was not stillness. Something brief and real and old in a way that had no business being on a face that young. "More than once, sir," she said. "At that distance, at greater distances, sir, under conditions considerably less controlled than this." Greer stepped forward. He had clearly decided that the conversation had reached a point where he needed to be part of it. "General, there are things I can brief you on within appropriate protocol. If you'd like to convene in a secure space, I can provide more context." Hale looked at Greer. "How long have you known about her?" A pause. 2 years, sir." 2 years? "Yes, sir." Hale looked back at Knox. She was standing with the Barrett at her side, and she looked the same as she had looked in the armory. The same as she had looked when he'd taken the rifle out of her hands, when he'd demanded her records, when Fetch had gone pale reading the blacked out file. Exactly the same. Like none of this was happening to her. like she was simply present for it, observing, waiting for everyone else to finish arriving at the conclusion she had already been living in. Staff Sergeant, he said. Sir, the shot at 19, the one that earned the badge. He stopped. He wasn't entirely sure he was cleared to ask the next question, but he asked it anyway. Did it matter? Did it do what it was supposed to do? She was quiet for a moment, not the careful quiet of someone deciding what to reveal. The quiet of someone feeling the weight of the true answer. 3 people came home because of it, sir, she said. That's all I can tell you. Hale nodded once. 3 people. He had written letters. He knew what 3 people meant. He knew the weight of it, the families, the futures, the things that happen and don't happen because one person comes home instead of not coming home. He had done the math in the dark of hotel rooms in countries whose names he couldn't say out loud. He knew exactly what 3 people meant. He turned to Greer. Set up the briefing. Secure room tonight. Yes, sir. Then he turned back to Knox, and he did something that General Richard Hale in 32 years of service had never done in front of junior personnel, in front of his aide, in front of a colonel. He held out his hand, not as rank, not as authority, just as one person acknowledging another. Good shot, Sergeant, he said. She looked at his hand, then she shook it. Her grip was firm, brief, professional. Thank you, sir. He released her hand and turned and walked back toward the vehicle. Fetch scrambled to follow. Morris lingered a moment longer looking at Knox. For what it's worth, Morris said quietly, I've been running armories a long time. I know when someone knows weapons the way you know weapons. He shook his head. I'm sorry I didn't say something this morning. When the general, Captain, she said, he stopped. It's fine, she said simply. You didn't know. Nobody knows. She picked up the carrying case and began breaking down the Barrett with the same efficient, unhurried hands she'd used in the armory that morning. That's the point. Morse watched her for another moment. Then he nodded slowly and walked away. Greer's 2 silent men were already at the vehicles. Greer himself had stepped away to make a call. Fetch was 30 yards away, talking into his own phone, probably managing the logistics of the secure briefing. For a moment, Mara Knox was alone on range 4. She finished breaking down the Barrett and secured the case. She stood up and looked north toward the ridgeline, where the gong was anchored invisible at this distance. Somewhere out there, 2 miles away, a 12-inch steel plate was still vibrating faintly from the impact of a round she had put through the cold mountain air without a spotter, without hesitation, without drama. She had been 19 the first time she'd made a shot that mattered. She had been alone that time, too. She picked up the case and turned back toward the vehicles. The mountains stood around the range on 3 sides, gray and enormous and indifferent, and Mara Knox walked through them with the particular stride of someone who has learned that the world is large, and that being small in it is not a disadvantage if you understand it correctly. Behind her, the steel gong on the ridgeline swayed once in a gust of northwest wind. Then it was still. Back at the vehicle's Fetch was watching her approach and thinking about the blacked-out file, about 19 years old. About 3 people who came home. About 3 200 meters confirmed, and whatever was on the other side of confirmed, whatever the conditions were, whatever the circumstances were that a government had decided needed to be erased from every accessible record. I thought about how this morning had started a routine inspection walk, a general running 4 minutes behind schedule, a half-open door. He thought about how completely ordinary the beginning of extraordinary things always looked. How you could walk past the most significant moment of your life without knowing it if you weren't paying attention. He had been paying attention today. He wasn't sure yet what he had learned exactly, but he knew he would be thinking about it for a long time. Mara Knox reached the vehicle and loaded the case. She looked at Fetch and gave him a small, businesslike nod. All set, Lieutenant, she said. Yes, he said. Yeah. He looked at her. Can I ask you something? She waited. This morning, in the armory, when the general took the rifle out of your hands. He paused. Were you scared? She considered the question with the same honesty she seemed to bring to everything else. Then she said no. Not at all. I've been in scarier rooms, sir. He believed her immediately and completely. They drove back to base in the same silence as before, and the mountains watched them go, and the cold gray morning had become a cold gray afternoon, and somewhere in Washington, D.C., in a building with no name on the door, a secure line was ringing. The secure briefing room in Building 12 had no windows. It had a table, 8 chairs, a wall-mounted screen that was currently dark, and a soundproofing system that made the silence feel physical. The kind of silence that pressed against your ears and reminded you that whatever was said in this room was meant to stay there. General Hale arrived first. He always arrived first. He sat at the head of the table and put both hands flat on the surface and looked at the dark screen and did not move for 2 full minutes. Fetch came in behind him, set a coffee on the table without being asked, and took a seat against the wall with his tablet. He had learned a long time ago that when the general went still like that, you did not speak. You waited. You gave him the room he needed to finish whatever was happening inside his head. What was happening inside Hale's head was this: he was going back through 32 years of service and trying to find something, anything that compared to what he had watched on Range 4 that afternoon. Not the shot itself, though the shot was extraordinary. The thing he kept returning to was the stillness. The absolute, unperformed, unremarkable stillness of a 22-year-old woman preparing to do something that should have been impossible and doing it like she was making coffee. Like it was just a thing she did. Like the distance and the wind and the cold and the absence of a spotter were details she had already filed and processed before anyone else had finished registering that they existed. Anya had known operators, real ones, men who had been through the pipeline that built the sharpest edges in the American military. He had shaken their hands and read their files, the unredacted ones, and understood what they had done and what it had cost them. He knew what elite looked like. He had a calibrated sense of it built over decades. What he had seen today did not fit inside that calibration, and that bothered him in a way he was still trying to name. Colonel Greer came in at 1800 hours exactly. He had one folder with him, thin, and he set it on the table but didn't open it. He sat down across from the empty chair beside Hale and looked at the general with the careful expression of a man who has been managing a complicated situation for a long time and is now deciding how much of it to set down. "She's not coming to this briefing," Hale said. It wasn't a question. "No, sir. What I'm able to share tonight doesn't require her presence, and frankly, the less she's associated with a formal briefing about her own program, the better for operational security." "Her own program," Hale repeated. "Yes, sir." "She's 22 years old, Sam. How does a 22-year-old have her own program?" Greer was quiet for a moment. Then he opened the folder. There was a single page inside, not blacked out, but sparse. Key dates, a few numbers, no names other than a program designation that meant nothing to Fetch. And from the look on his face, not much more to the general. "She was recruited at 16, Greer said. The room absorbed that. Fetch looked up from his tablet. "Recruited," Hale said flatly. "By whom?" "A joint task force that I cannot name in this environment, even with your clearance, sir. What I can tell you is that it operates outside standard DoD architecture. The program identifies individuals with a specific and extremely rare combination of physiological and cognitive traits. Visual acuity that falls outside the measurable range of standard testing. Spatial processing that functions differently than a typical human brain, not better or worse in general terms, but specifically and dramatically better in the context of long-range ballistic calculation. And a psychological profile that," he paused, chose his words carefully, "that allows them to operate in high-stakes environments without the cortisol response that degrades fine motor control under stress." Hale stared at him. "She doesn't feel fear." "She feels it, sir. The physiological response is present, but her nervous system processes it differently. It doesn't translate into the physical degradation that affects most shooters under pressure. For her, high-stakes conditions produce a state closer to heightened focus than to threat response." Fetch set his tablet down on his knee very slowly. "She was 16, Hale said again. "Yes, sir. She was identified through a civilian marksmanship program. Her scores at that level were so anomalous that they triggered an automatic flag in a system most people don't know exists. She was approached. Her family was briefed under a very specific legal framework. She agreed to enter a training pipeline that doesn't appear in any military record because it technically isn't one, not under any designation that standard oversight would recognize. That's legal. It exists in a space that Congress authorized through legislation. I cannot cite directly, sir. The oversight is real. It's just not visible through normal channels." Hale looked at the thin folder. "What about the shot? The one at 19, the 3 people who came home?" Greer closed the folder. Sir, that specific operation is classified at a level that this room is not equipped to discuss. What I can tell you is that it was real, the outcome was verified, and the individuals who came home would not have come home without her. And she was alone. A pause. Yes, sir. A 19-year-old girl, alone, making a shot that saved 3 lives. Yes, sir. And nobody knows. Greer held his gaze. That's the nature of the program, General. The work exists, the outcomes exist, the person who did it officially on any accessible record does not. Hale sat with that for a long moment. Fetch was watching the General the way you watch someone who's carrying something heavy and you can't help them with it. Then Hale said something that surprised them both. He said it quietly, almost to himself. Does she have anyone family? Greer's expression shifted, just slightly. Her mother, sir, in Ohio. They communicate when operational security permits. Does her mother know what she does? Her mother knows that her daughter serves in a capacity she cannot discuss, and that she is safe to the degree that anyone in this work is safe, and that what she does matters. A pause. She calls home when she can. The calls are monitored and filtered, but they happen. Hale nodded slowly. He thought about a mother in Ohio waiting for a phone call from a daughter whose job description didn't exist. He thought about what that kind of love looked like, loving someone into a silence that swallowed them, and trusting because you had to trust that the silence meant they were still out there somewhere, doing something that mattered. He had written those letters. He knew the other version of that story, the one where the call stops coming. He stood up. I want to see her, he said. Greer looked up. Sir, Baum. Not officially, not as a briefing. I want to talk to her. He picked up the coffee Fetch had brought and took a drink and set it back down. Tonight. Sir, I'm not sure that's... It's not a request, Colonel. Greer looked at him for a long moment. Then he nodded. Mara Knox was in the armory. Of course she was. Fetch had sent someone to find her and had been mildly unsurprised when the report came back that she was in Armory 7 working late running maintenance checks on the inventory she had been cataloging since her arrival 3 weeks ago. Nobody had asked her to. Nobody had assigned it. She had simply decided the inventory needed proper maintenance documentation and had started doing it. Hale walked in alone. He had told Fetch to wait outside, and Fetch had not argued. The armory was quieter at night, just the hum of the climate control system and the particular hush of a large space with no people moving through it. Knox looked up when he came in. She was at the long center table with a field-stripped M4 in front of her and a cleaning kit open beside it. She didn't scramble. She set the component she was holding down and stood. At ease, he said, before she could come to attention. This isn't official. She settled, waited. He sat down on the bench across the table from her. This was unusual enough that he saw her register it, a flicker across her face there, and gone the smallest recalibration. Greer told me some things tonight, he said. Yes, sir. He told me you were recruited at 16. Yes, sir. And that you've been operating in this program since then. Yes, sir. He looked at her, really looked the way he hadn't let himself fully do before because rank and protocol create a certain kind of managed distance. She looked young. She looked exactly as young as she was, which was something he hadn't let himself acknowledge until right now. There was a quality to her steadiness that he had been reading as professional composure, and it was that, but it was also something else. It was the steadiness of someone who had been carrying something alone for long enough that aloneness had stopped feeling like a condition and had started feeling like a ground state. Do you ever wish someone knew, he said. She blinked, not a dramatic blink, a real one. The question had caught her somewhere unguarded. Sir, she said, what you've done, what you're capable of. Do you ever wish, he stopped, chose the next words carefully. Does it ever get heavy being unknown? A long silence, not the strategic kind, the real kind where a person is actually going somewhere inside themselves and needs a moment to come back. Sometimes, she said finally, not often, but sometimes. Tell me about sometimes. She looked down at the field-stripped M4 on the table. Her hands were still. When I call my mother, she said, she asks how I'm doing. She asks if I'm safe. And I tell her I'm fine and I'm safe and that I can't tell her anything else. She paused. She doesn't complain. She never complains. She just says she loves me and she's proud of me and she'll be there when I can come home. A beat. I don't know how she does that. I don't know how she holds all that not knowing and doesn't. She stopped. Doesn't fall apart, Hale said. Yes, sir. I was quiet for a moment. My wife did it for 26 years, he said. I was gone more than I was home for most of those. She held everything, the kids, the house, the fear. She held it and she didn't fall apart, and I didn't understand how until I watched her hold it and realized it wasn't something she did. It was something she was. Some people are built to hold the weight of someone else's service. They don't get badges for it. Nobody confirms it, but it's real work. Knox was looking at him now with an expression he hadn't seen on her face before. Not softness exactly, more like recognition. Like he had said something that fit a shape she had been carrying around for years without a name for it. My mother is like that, she said quietly. She sounds like it. A silence settled between them that was different from the silences earlier in the day. Not strategic, not professionally managed, just two people in a room at night with the truth laid on the table between them. Then Knox said carefully, "Can I ask you something, sir?" "Go ahead." "This morning, when you took the Barrett," she held his gaze, "was it because you didn't think I should have it, or because you couldn't figure out why I did?" He looked at her for a long moment. The honest answer arrived before the diplomatic one, which was how he knew it was the right one to give. "Both," he said, "but mostly the second one, and the second one made the first one louder than it needed to be." She nodded, once, accepting it. "I've had that happen before," she said. "Men who can't place me where I fit, what authority I have, why I'm holding what I'm holding, and the not knowing turns into something that looks like anger, because anger is easier than confusion." Hale felt the accuracy of that land somewhere uncomfortable. He didn't deflect it. "That's fair," he said. "I'm not saying it to be, I know you're not." He held up a hand. "It's fair, I did that, and the record will show I was wrong to do it." She said nothing, but something in her posture released very slightly, almost imperceptibly, the smallest fraction of the weight she carried shifting. He stood up. He was about to say good night, about to return to the managed world of rank and protocol and secure briefings, when something stopped him. A question he hadn't planned to ask, the kind that appears fully formed without warning because something in the conversation has opened a door you didn't know was there. "Knox," he said, "the three people who came home. Do you know what happened to them after?" She looked at him steadily. "One of them has 2 kids now, sir," she said. "I know because there are certain things I'm allowed to know, even if they can't know about me." A pause. "The youngest one is about 3 months old. Her name is May." Hale stared at her. A child named May, 3 months old, alive in the world, because a 19-year-old had held still in a place she couldn't name and done something that shouldn't have been possible, and then come home and gone back to work in an armory and cataloged inventory and said nothing to anyone. He straightened, pulled his composure back around himself, the way you pull a jacket closed in cold air. "Thank you for telling me that," he said. "Thank you for asking, sir." He nodded once and walked to the door. He had his hand on it when she spoke again. "Sir," he turned. "The scope mount on the M82A1, she said. "I put the work order in this afternoon. Replacement is scheduled for 0700 tomorrow. I documented the tolerance deviation and the potential accuracy impact for the record." A pause. "I wanted to make sure that was done properly, whatever else happens." He looked at her across the length of the armory. She was standing beside the table with the field-stripped M4, and she looked exactly like what she was, a soldier doing her job at the end of a long day, making sure the work was accounted for before she left. "Good work, Sergeant," he said. "Sir," she said. He pushed the door open and walked out into the night, and the cold hit him immediately, sharp and clean, and he stood still for a moment outside the armory door and did not move. Fetch was waiting 10 feet away. He looked at the general and did not ask. He had learned in 2 years of working for this man to read the difference between silences. This one was not the silence of decision or strategy or anger. It was the silence of something that had shifted and had not yet finished settling. They walked back to the main building in the dark. "Halfway there," Hale said without looking at Fetch. "She has a niece, sort of. Not blood, but a child. Alive because of a shot nobody knows she took." Fetch said nothing. "That's what it costs," Hale said. "Not the danger, not the secrecy, the not knowing. That's what it costs these people." Fetch walked beside him and did not try to fill the space with words, because there were no words that fit inside that space, and they both knew it. Inside the main building, behind a desk, in an office with the light still on, Colonel Greer was on the phone. His voice was low. His expression was the expression of a man receiving information he has been expecting and is not happy to receive. He pressed two fingers against the bridge of his nose and said, "When and then how many, and then very carefully, does she know yet?" He hung up. He sat for a moment with the phone still in his hand. Then he picked it up again and dialed a number that had no name attached to it in his contacts list, just a series of digits he had memorized 5 years ago and had called 17 times since. It answered on the second ring. "It's Greer," he said. "We have a situation. Washington is asking questions." A pause while the other end spoke. "Not about the program," Greer said. "About Knox specifically. Someone at oversight level has seen an informal report about today's demonstration. I don't know who, I don't know what they have. But they're asking questions, and they're asking them through channels that tell me this isn't routine curiosity." Another pause. Greer's jaw tightened. "I understand," he said. "I'll handle it from my end. But she needs to know." A longer pause. "I know it's protocol. I'm telling you the protocol needs to bend slightly in this situation because if Washington moves before she's prepared, we lose control of the narrative and everything we've spent 6 years building goes with it." He listened. "Good," he said. "I'll brief her at 0600. He hung up again. He sat alone in the lit office with the dark outside pressing against the window and thought about Mara Knox in the armory at 19 alone, doing the impossible thing, and about the years since, and about Washington with its informal reports, in its oversight hearings, in its tendency to treat extraordinary human beings as strategic assets to be managed rather than people to be protected. He thought about the child named May, 3 months old. I thought about what happened when the classified world and the visible world collided without warning. He picked up the folder from the secure briefing, the thin one, the sparse one, and he looked at the program designation on the cover. Then he put it in the burn box beside his desk and locked the box. Some things needed to stay in the dark a little longer. Not forever, just long enough to control what happened when the light finally came. Greer found her at 0550, 10 minutes before he had planned to because he had not slept, and at some point after 3 in the morning, he had stopped pretending he was going to. She was already awake. That did not surprise him. She was at the small desk in her quarters with a notebook open and a pen in her hand, and when he knocked and she opened the door, she looked at his face and said immediately without preamble, "What happened?" Not a question, a read. "May I come in?" he said. She stepped back and let him in and closed the door and stood with her arms at her sides waiting. She was in uniform already. Of course she was. He sat down in the single chair the room provided. She remained standing. He had learned years ago not to tell her to sit. She processed things better on her feet. He didn't fully understand the mechanics of it, but he had learned to work with it. "Washington knows about yesterday," he said. She was still. "How much?" "Enough. Someone at oversight level received an informal report about the Range 4 demonstration. I don't have the source yet. I don't know exactly what they were told, but I know the questions they're asking, and the questions tell me they know more than a brief summary." She took a slow breath. "The program. The program is still contained. What they're asking about is you, specifically. Your capability, your record, and why a staff sergeant with a classification marker nobody can identify is stationed at a conventional base doing armory work." She turned and walked 2 steps and turned back. It was the first time Greer had seen her pace. In 6 years, he could count on one hand the times Mara Knox had paced. "Who's asking?" "A senator's office. Defense Oversight Subcommittee. The senator himself I can manage. He's reasonable and he understands the architecture of classification. But there are 2 staffers attached to this inquiry who are not reasonable and do not care about architecture. They care about visibility. They care about what plays in a hearing room." She looked at him directly. "They want to use it." "They want to use you," he said. "There's a difference, and the difference matters. Using the capability is a conversation about national security and program integrity. Using you is a conversation about optics, about what it looks like to have someone like you doing what you've been doing unknown, unacknowledged for 6 years. That's a different kind of story, and it draws a different kind of attention." She said nothing for a moment. Her eyes had gone to the middle distance, not vacant calculating. He had seen this before. She was running it, all of it. The variables, the outcomes, the branches. "If they pull me into a hearing," she said. "That is not going to happen," he said firmly. If it does, he met her eyes. If it does, the program ends. Not because of the testimony we can manage what's said in a classified session, but because the act of making you visible breaks the fundamental operational premise. You work because nobody knows. The moment you become a known quantity, you become a target, not a useful asset, a target. She absorbed that. And General Hale, Greer paused. What about him? He knows now, not everything, but enough. He shook my hand on range 4 in front of his aide and a captain and 2 of your people. That's not nothing. Hale is not the problem. Hale I trust. He said it without hesitation and meant it. What I don't trust is the information chain that led from an informal report to a Senate subcommittee in less than 18 hours. That chain is fast, faster than it should be for something this contained. She caught it immediately. You think it came from inside the base. I think it came from someone who was at range 4 yesterday or who received a report from someone who was. He watched her face. I'm not saying it was intentional. Someone may have mentioned it casually in the wrong context. But I need to know who talked, and I need to know it before Washington decides to push harder. She sat down on the edge of the bunk. Not because she was tired, because she had finished running the variables and had arrived somewhere and needed to be still while she looked at Ed. Fetch, she said. Greer went very still. Why? Hal was watching me the whole time I was working in the armory yesterday morning. Not the way Morris was watching me. Morris was cataloging, trying to place me professionally. Fetch was watching the way people watch things they're going to tell someone about later. She paused. I'm not saying he meant harm. I think he genuinely doesn't understand what he's part of. But he talks to people. You can tell. He's the kind of person who processes things by talking about them. Greer was quiet for a long moment. She was right. He knew it, the way you know things that have been sitting in the back of your mind waiting to be acknowledged. Fetch was not malicious. Fetch was 26 and enthusiastic and deeply constitutionally unable to hold something extraordinary inside himself without it leaking out somewhere. He had probably mentioned it to another aide or a junior officer or someone back home. And from there, it had traveled the way. Information traveled in the invisible network that connected the military to the political world. Not a spy, just a person who had witnessed something he couldn't contain. I'll handle it, Greer said. Handle it carefully, she said. He's a good aide. He doesn't deserve to have his career ended over a conversation he didn't know was classified. Greer looked at her. In 6 years, this was one of the things that had never changed about her. The precision, the accuracy, but also the instinct to protect the people in the blast radius who hadn't chosen to be there. I'll be careful, he said. He stood. He had said what he came to say, and he had heard what he needed to hear, and he had 7 things to do before 8 in the morning. But he stopped at the door because something else needed to be said. And if he walked out without saying it, it would stay unsaid in a way that mattered. Mara, he said. He used her first name deliberately. He used it about 4 times a year. She noticed every time. She looked up. Whatever Washington decides to do, however this unfolds, what you did at 19, what you have done every time since it is known, not broadly, not publicly, but by the people who were there and the people who were brought home and the people in certain rooms who keep the actual record of what this country asks of people and what people give. He held her gaze. It is known. I need you to know that I know it. She looked at him for a long moment. Something moved across her face. Not tears, she didn't do that, at least not here, at least not in front of him. Something quieter, something that looked like a person who has been carrying a thing alone for a very long time and has just been told briefly and inadequately but truly that they are not entirely alone with it. Thank you, sir, she said. He nodded and walked out. The door closed behind him, and Mara Knox sat on the edge of her bunk in the early morning dark and did not move for a while. Then she picked up the notebook, found the page she had been writing on before he knocked, and kept writing. It was a letter. She wrote them sometimes and didn't send them, not because she couldn't, but because some things were easier to say on paper first in the dark before the day got loud. It was addressed to her mother. General Hale found out about the Washington inquiry at Oak 7:30 when Greer called him directly instead of going through Fetch. The fact that Greer had gone around Fetch told Hale everything he needed to know about where Greer's suspicions were pointing. He did not address it directly. He filed it. How serious, he said into the phone. Serious enough that I'm asking you to do something that falls outside normal protocol, sir, Greer said. I'm asking you to make a call, directly, to Senator Wentworth's office. Hale's jaw tightened. He knew Wentworth. They had sat across from each other in 3 different classified briefings over the past decade. Wentworth was not a man you called casually, and he was not a man who backed down from something once his office had picked it up. But he was also critically a man who had served. 30 years ago. Infantry. He understood at a cellular level certain things about operational integrity that people who hadn't served sometimes had to be walked through slowly. What do I say, Hale said. You tell him what you saw. Not the program, don't touch the program, but the shot, the capability. The fact that disrupting the operational environment of an asset like this is not a political win, it is a strategic loss, and that someone with his record and his understanding of national security should recognize the difference. Greer paused. You say it as a fellow veteran, not as a general. As someone who stood on that range yesterday and saw something that this country needs to be able to keep doing. A silence. Hale was looking at the wall of his office where his commendations were mounted, 14 of them, each one a story, each one a weight. She doesn't know I'm making this call, he said. No, sir. Is she going to be angry about it? Greer considered that honestly. She might be, sir. She has a strong preference for managing her own situation. I noticed. But she will also understand that certain things require people outside herself to act, and she will accept it. Eventually. Hale almost smiled. You've known her a while. 6 years, sir. She was 16 when you met her. A pause. Yes, sir, she was. Another pause, and something in Greer's voice shifted just slightly, just enough. She walked into the assessment room and scored numbers I'd been told were not physiologically possible for a human visual system. She was 16 years old, and she looked at the target array and she said, the third target is 7 millimeters lower than the diagram indicates. Is that intentional or a setup error? It was an intentional discrepancy we put in to see if anyone caught it. No one ever had. Not in 4 years of running that assessment. He stopped. I told her it was intentional. She said, okay, does that affect how I should approach the sequence? I told her it didn't. She said okay and completed the assessment in 41% less time than the previous best. And she was 16. Hale sat with that. Make the call, sir, Greer said. For what it's worth, I think she'd make it herself if she could. But she can't. That's why we're here. Hale hung up and sat for 30 seconds, and then picked the phone back up and dialed a number he had not dialed in 2 years and listened to it ring. It picked up on the third ring. Wentworth, said the voice on the other end. Jim, Hale said. It's Richard Hale. I need 10 minutes. Fetch spent the morning in a state of carefully maintained normalcy that was costing him more effort than he wanted to admit. He had work to do, real work, the kind of administrative logistics that kept a general's schedule functioning, and he did it. He answered emails. He confirmed the 1100 briefing. He coordinated with the motor pool about the general's vehicle for the afternoon inspection. And he did not think about the fact that at 2200 hours the night before, he had sent a text to his friend Marcus, who worked in the Pentagon liaison office, saying only, you won't believe what I watched today. A staff sergeant, range 4, no spotter, 200 meters, actually happened. He had thought it was harmless. Marcus wasn't an oversight. Marcus wasn't connected to anything that would escalate something like that. Marcus was just a friend who loved military history and would appreciate the story. He had not thought about who Marcus talked to. He had not thought about the chain. At 9:15, Greer appeared at the door of Fetch's workspace. He came in and closed the door behind him, which Greer had never done before. Greer was always in motion, a door open, quick exchange kind of operator. A closed door was a different conversation. Fetch felt the blood leave his face before Greer said a single word. Lieutenant, Greer said, and his voice was not unkind, which somehow made it worse. I need to ask you about a message you sent last night. Fetch's stomach turned over completely. Sir, I'm not here to end your career, Greer said. I need you to understand that immediately, because what I'm about to tell you is going to feel very serious, and I need you thinking clearly, not defensively. He sat down. He made it feel like a conversation, not an interrogation, because he was very good at this. Tell me about the message. Fetch told him all of it, every word. He didn't edit or minimize, because editing and minimizing in front of someone who already knew the answer was a form of dishonesty. he was constitutionally unsuited for, and also because Greer was watching him with the patient, accurate eyes of someone who would catch every edit. When he finished, Greer was quiet for a moment. You didn't know, Greer said. No, sir. I didn't know Marcus would. I don't even know what Marcus did. I don't know how it got to. It doesn't matter exactly how. It matters that it moved. Greer leaned forward slightly. What you saw yesterday is real. What Knox does is real, and the reason it works, the reason she is able to do what she does and come home and do it again, is because it stays unknown. The moment it becomes a story, it becomes a target. Do you understand what I mean by that? Yes, sir. Fetch's voice was very quiet. She becomes a target. Specifically by name, by capability, by location. Greer held his gaze. The people she has protected herself from operationally, they don't know she exists. That is the only reason she's still here to replace scope mounts and annotate inventory forms. Fetch felt something cold settle in his chest that had nothing to do with temperature. Is she in danger? He said, because of what I... Not imminently, Greer said. What you sent reached domestic political channels, not operational adversarial channels. That is a very important distinction, and it is the only reason this conversation is taking place instead of something considerably more serious. He paused. But domestic political channels have their own kind of danger, different shape, different timeline, no less real. Fetch nodded. He was holding very still, the way people hold still when they are trying not to show that they are shaking. What do I do, sir? He said. You go back to your work, Greer said. You do not discuss yesterday with anyone, not Marcus, not your family, not in a journal, not in a personal email. You treat what you saw on Range 4 the way you would treat a code word classified operation, because that is what it is and that is what it has always been. And the fact that it looked like a Tuesday afternoon on a rifle range does not change that. He stood. And you give Marcus my number and tell him to call me. Today. Fetch swallowed. Yes, sir. Greer moved toward the door. His hand was on it when Fetch spoke. Colonel, his voice came out rougher than he intended. Does she know that it was me? Greer stopped. He turned. He looked at Fetch with the particular expression of a man deciding between two true things and choosing the one that serves better. She knows someone talked, he said. She doesn't know it was you specifically. Fetch nodded. She also said, Greer continued, and his tone shifted just slightly, that whoever it was, they didn't mean harm, and that their career shouldn't be ended over a conversation they didn't know was classified. He held Fetch's gaze. She said it before I told her anything. That's the kind of person you're protecting by keeping this quiet from here on. He walked out. Fetch sat alone in his workspace for a long time. Then he picked up his phone and called Marcus. By 1100, General Hale had finished his call with Senator Wentworth and was sitting in his office with his hands flat on the desk, looking at nothing. The way he had looked at nothing in the secure briefing room the night before. But this time the stillness felt different. This time it felt like something resolved rather than something pending. Wentworth had listened, really listened, the listening of a man who had been in enough situations to know when someone was telling him something that required more than a political response. He had asked two questions, one about operational integrity and one about the chain of classification that governed Knox's program. Hale had answered them as directly as he could within the bounds of what he knew. Wentworth had been quiet for a long moment at the end and then said, I'll pull my people back, for now. But Richard, if this capability is as significant as you're describing, at some point the institution needs to have a real conversation about how we recognize it. Not publicly, but institutionally. Hale had said, I agree with you completely, but that conversation needs to happen on her terms and her timeline, not because a Senate staffer saw an informal report and decided it was a story. Another silence. Then Wentworth had said, understood, I'll handle my end. That had been 40 minutes ago. Greer had confirmed at 10:55 that the inquiry from the subcommittee's office had gone quiet. Not closed, Wentworth was careful he wouldn't close something he might need later, but quiet, for now the pressure had released. Hale got up and walked to the window. He could see the motor pool from here, and beyond it, the edge of Armory Building 7, and beyond that, the mountains. He thought about Range 4. He thought about the sound of the steel gong at 2 miles. There was a knock at the door. Come, he said. It was Morris. The captain stepped in and stood correctly and looked at the general with the expression he had been wearing intermittently since yesterday afternoon. the expression of a man who had seen something that rearranged his internal landscape and was still finding out where everything had landed. Sir, Morris said, I wanted to report the scope mount replacement on the M82A1 was completed this morning at 00712. Knox did it herself, documented everything, filed the maintenance report in proper order. He paused. The report is thorough. It's the most thorough maintenance documentation I've seen submitted for a single rifle in 17 years. Hale turned from the window. Is that what you came to tell me, Captain? Morris hesitated. No, sir. I came to tell you. He stopped. Tried again. I've been running armories and managing equipment for a long time, sir. I know how to read soldiers. I can tell you a lot about a person from how they handle weapons, the care they use, the knowledge they show, the respect for the equipment. That tells you something real. And Knox. Knox handles that Barrett the way I have never seen anyone handle a weapon, sir. Not in 17 years. Not operators who came through during training rotations. Not senior NCOs with 20 years on the platform. He paused. And she's 22. And she's been doing this since she was 16. He shook his head slightly. I don't know what the right word is for what she is, sir. But whatever it is, I think we've been using the wrong words for it. Hale looked at him for a long moment. We have, he said simply. Morris nodded. That was enough. He turned to leave. Morris. Sir. Make sure her maintenance documentation gets into the permanent record. All of it. The tolerance deviation she caught, the replacement, the full report. I want it on record that she caught something nobody else caught and fixed it correctly. Morris straightened. Yes, sir. He left. Hale stood alone in his office and thought about permanent records and what they captured and what they didn't, and how much of what actually happened in the service of this country lived in files that no one would ever read, in rooms that officially didn't exist, in the steady hands of people whose names were blacked out from their own personnel records. I thought about a girl who had walked into an assessment room at 16 and caught a 7mm discrepancy before anyone told her to look for one. He picked up his phone. He dialed a number that wasn't Greer and wasn't Wentworth, a number that belonged to a general 2 ranks above him in a building in Virginia who oversaw programs that Hale had clearance to know existed, but not to know the details of. The phone rang once. I know why you're calling, said the voice on the other end. Then you know what I'm going to say, Hale said. Say it anyway. She needs more than a badge. No one can see, Hale said. I'm not talking about public recognition. I'm not talking about anything that compromises the program. I'm talking about the institution knowing at whatever level it can know what it has in her, what it has been asking of her, and what it owes her. A silence. That's a complicated conversation, Richard. I know it is, Hale said. I'm asking you to start having it. Another silence. Longer this time. I'll make some calls, the voice said. Hale hung up and sat down and felt for the first time since he had walked into Armory 7 24 hours ago. Something that was not confusion or recalibration or the specific discomfort of having been wrong about something fundamental. He felt certain about one specific thing, about what the right next thing was, even if it was small, even if it moved slowly, even if Mara Knox never knew he had made the call. Some things you did because they were right, not because anyone would confirm them. He understood that now in a different way than he had understood it yesterday morning. The call came at 1400 hours, not to Greer, not to Hale, directly to the secure line in Mara's quarters, a line that almost nobody had the number for, a line that had rung exactly 4 times in the 3 years since it had been assigned to her. She picked it up on the first ring. Knox, she said. The voice on the other end was one she recognized immediately. Not because she heard it often, because you did not forget the voice of the person who had looked at your assessment scores 6 years ago and told you plainly and without drama that you were going to be asked to do things that most people could not do, and that the choice to do them was entirely yours, and that if you said no, you would walk out of that room and go back to your life, and no one would think less of you for it. She had not said no. I heard about Range Force, said General Patricia Voss, Deputy Director of the Joint Task Force, that officially did not exist. Her voice was exactly as Mara remembered it, measured, precise, carrying the particular weight of a woman who had spent 40 years being the most competent person in rooms that refused to acknowledge it. Yes, ma'am, Mara said. Hale called Caldwell this morning, Voss said. Caldwell was the 2-star above Hale in Virginia. He made a case for institutional recognition. Within classified channels, nothing public. Mara was quiet. I want to know how you feel about that, Voss said. This was the thing about Voss that Mara had understood from the first day. She asked. She actually asked. Not as performance, not as management technique. She asked because she believed the answer mattered, and she was willing to change course based on it. In 6 years of working inside a program that treated her as an asset first and a person second, Voss was the consistent exception. I feel like it wasn't his call to make, Mara said carefully, and a pause. And I also think he made it for the right reasons. Those two things can both be true, Voss said. Yes, ma'am. What I need to know, Knox, is whether the events of the last 48 hours have compromised your operational comfort at Ironcliff. Because if they have, we move you, quietly. New station clean slate, we manage the Washington situation from our end, and you disappear back into the work. Mara sat with that. The offer was real. Voss didn't make offers she didn't mean. A new station clean slate. It was what the program did when an environment became operationally complicated. It was efficient, it was protective, and it was in its way another kind of erasure. Pack up, go somewhere new. Let what happened here become another blacked out line in a file no one could read. She thought about the armory, about the M82A1 with the 17 micron tolerance deviation that she had caught and documented and fixed because it needed fixing regardless of anything else. She thought about Morris saying, I've never felt like this watching someone get ready to shoot. She thought about Hale across the table in the armory the night before asking if it ever got heavy being unknown. She thought about him holding out his hand after the shot on range 4. Not as rank, not as authority, just as a person acknowledging another person. She thought about Fetch, who had talked because he was 26 and had witnessed something extraordinary and was physiologically incapable of containing it, and who she had protected before she even knew it was him, because that was the right thing to do. She thought about the letter to her mother half written in the notebook on her desk. I'd like to stay, ma'am, she said, a beat. Tell me why. Because running is what you do when the environment is unsafe. This environment is not unsafe. It's complicated. There's a difference. She paused. And because the inventory in Armory 7 is poorly documented and someone needs to finish fixing it, there was a silence on the line. And then rare brief real, Voss laughed. It was a small sound, but it was genuine. All right, she said, you stay. But Knox, the Washington situation is not fully resolved. Wentworth went quiet because Hale asked him to. Quiet is not closed. If it opens again, we may not have the same options. I understand, ma'am. And the Fetch situation. Handled, ma'am. Greer spoke with him. He won't talk again. You're not angry at him. It wasn't quite a question. Mara considered it honestly. He's 26 and he saw something he didn't have a framework for, and he told someone he trusted. That's a human response. I've seen worse judgment from people with considerably more experience. She paused. I'm not angry. Another silence. Then Voss said quietly, you know what the hardest part of building this program was? It wasn't the training architecture. It wasn't the legal framework. It wasn't the classification system. She stopped. It was finding people who were extraordinary at the work and still fundamentally decent as human beings. Because extraordinary without decency is just a dangerous tool. But extraordinary with decency, she stopped again. That's something worth protecting. Mara felt something tighten in her chest. She kept her voice even. Thank you, ma'am. Finish the inventory, Voss said, and Knox, call your mother. The line went dead. Mara set the phone down and sat still for a long moment. Then she picked up the notebook, looked at the half-written letter, and closed it. Then she picked up her personal phone, the one with the monitored line that filtered certain things and allowed others, and she dialed a number she knew by heart. It rang twice. Mara heard mother's voice. Instantly warm, instantly present the specific warmth of a woman who had spent years answering that phone and feeling the particular relief that the call was coming at all. Hi, Mom, she said. Honey? Pause. The pause of her mother reading the quality of her voice, which she had always been able to do with an accuracy that Mara had never fully understood. Are you okay? I'm okay, Mara said. I wanted to talk. Then talk, her mother said simply. I'm right here. And for a little while in a small room on a military base in the middle of mountains, her mother had never seen and couldn't know the name of Mara Knox talked. Not about operations or classifications or 3,000-meter shots or Senate subcommittees. About small things. About the cold and the way the mornings hit differently at altitude, and about a ridiculous problem she'd found in the armory inventory where someone had cataloged a batch of cleaning kits under the wrong part number for what appeared to be 3 consecutive years. Her mother laughed at that. Mara almost laughed too. "You sound different," her mother said after a while. Mara considered that. "Different how?" "I don't know exactly. Less alone, maybe." A pause. Did something happen? Mara looked at the wall, at the notebook on the desk, at the secure phone that had rung for the 4th time in 3 years. "Some people found out what I do," she said. "Not everything, but some of it. And she stopped. They treated it like it mattered." Her mother was quiet for a moment. When she spoke, her voice was steady in the way that Hale had described the night before, the steadiness of someone who had learned to hold the weight of another person's invisible work and carry it without complaint for years because love sometimes looked like that. "It does matter," her mother said. "It has always mattered. You have always mattered, even when nobody knew." Mara pressed her lips together, kept her voice even. "I know, Mom." Do you actually know it, or do you just tell yourself you know it?" A long pause. "I'm working on actually knowing it," Mara said. "Good," her mother said. "That's all I need to hear." They talked for another 20 minutes. When the call ended, Mara sat for a moment in the quiet. Then she stood up, picked up her cover, and walked out the door and back to the armory. She had inventory to finish. General Hale found her there at 1600 hours. He had not planned to come. He had a full afternoon schedule, and he had completed it: the 1100 briefing, 2 personnel reviews, a logistics coordination meeting that ran long in the way logistics meetings always ran long. He should have gone back to his office. He should have gone over the report Fetch had prepared on the week's inspection findings. Instead, he found himself walking toward Armory 7. He told himself it was a routine check. He was convincing enough that he almost believed it. She looked up when he came in. Same red as always, taking in the rank, the posture, the purpose faster than most people blink. "Sir," she said. "As you were," he said. He walked to the center table and looked at what she was working on. More inventory. A different section this time. She had moved methodically from one end of the armory to the other, he realized. Systematically correcting 3 years of sloppy documentation with the same quiet precision she brought to everything else. He sat down across from her. She kept working. "Voss called you," he said. It wasn't a question. She glanced up briefly. "Yes, sir." "You're staying?" "Yes, sir," he nodded. He had expected that. He had not known why he had expected it exactly, but it had not surprised him. "Knox," he said, "I owe you an apology." She set her pen down. She looked at him directly and waited because she understood that some apologies needed to be given their full space. "Yesterday morning," he said, "in this room, when I took that rifle out of your hands." He held her gaze. "That was wrong, not procedurally wrong. I mean, it was procedurally wrong as well, given what I now know about your authorization. But I mean something else. I took it because I made an assumption about what you were, about what you could possibly be, based on what I could see, which was your age and your size and your rank, and I did not wait for one additional second of evidence before I acted on that assumption." He paused. 32 years of service, and I still did that. That's the apology. She was quiet for a moment. "Sir, you don't have to." "I know I don't have to," he said. "That's why it matters that I am." She looked at him, and she said something that he had not expected. "When you put your hand out on range 4, she said, "after the shot, do you know what that was worth?" He shook his head slightly. "In 6 years of this work," she said, "I have had 2 people extend their hand to me and mean it the way you meant it. 2, not commanders, not program supervisors, not officials in rooms, managing my situation from a distance. 2 people who saw what I could do and responded to it the way you respond to a person, not an asset." She held his gaze. "Voss and you, yesterday afternoon." She paused. "The apology means something, sir, but what you did on that range, that already meant something. Before this conversation." Hale sat with that. He felt the truth of it settle somewhere deep and stay there. "Thank you," he said quietly. She picked up her pen. "The apology accepted, sir," she said. And there was something in her voice, not warmth exactly, because warmth implied the absence of it before, more like the acknowledgement of a thing brought into the open and properly placed. He stood. He was going to leave. He had said what he came to say, and she had said what needed to be said in return, and the conversation was complete. But he stopped because something had been sitting in the back of his mind since the night before, since she had told him about the 3 people who came home, since she had said the youngest one was 3 months old, and her name was May. Knox, he said. Sir, the letter. The ones you write and don't send. He watched her face. He had not told her he knew about them. Her expression shifted, not much, but enough. Greer mentioned it, not the contents, just that you do it. He paused. I want you to know someday, when this work is done, and you can talk about it, those letters are going to matter to the person you wrote them to. Not because of the details. Because they'll know you thought of them. In the middle of all of it, you thought of them. She looked at him for a long moment. Something moved behind her eyes that she did not bring to the surface. She kept it there, held it there, the way she held everything present and contained and real. Yes, sir, she said, very quietly. He nodded once and walked out. Morris was waiting in the corridor outside. He hadn't planned to intercept the general. He had simply been coming to check the end-of-day report from the armory and had seen Hale go in and had waited because it seemed like the thing to do. Captain Hale said, Sir? Morris fell into step beside him. I've been thinking about what you asked me yesterday. On range 4, how I felt. I remember. I said I felt like something was about to happen that I wouldn't understand right away. He walked beside the general in the corridor. I was right, sir. I don't fully understand it yet. What she is, what she's been doing, what it means that someone like that is here in my armory doing inventory forms and catching scope tolerances that nobody else would catch. He shook his head. But I think the not fully understanding is the right response. I think that means I'm seeing it accurately. Hale looked at him sideways. How do you mean? If I fully understood it, it would mean I had reduced it to something small enough to fit inside what I already know. And what I already know isn't big enough for this. He paused. So the not understanding, that's the appropriate size of the response. Hale walked in silence for a moment. Morris, he said, you're a better officer than your rank suggests. Morris blinked. Sir, that's a compliment. Accept it. Yes, sir. Thank you, sir. Fetch was in the general's outer office when Hale returned. He was working or approximating work in the way of someone who is performing functionality while their mind is somewhere else. He looked up when Hale came in, and the look on his face was the look he had been carrying all day. Not guilt exactly, something more specific. The look of someone who has understood the weight of something they did and cannot undo it, but has decided to carry the understanding forward instead. Hale looked at him. You called Marcus, he said. Fetch went very still. Sir Greer spoke with me this morning. I didn't know that you... I know you didn't know. That's not the same as it not having consequences. He held the young man's gaze steadily. Greer told me it's handled. I believe him. I also believe you will never do anything like it again. No, sir, never. Good. He turned toward his office door. Then he stopped. Fetch. Sir. She told Greer before she knew it was you that whoever talked probably didn't mean harm, and that their career shouldn't end over it. He looked at him. She said it before she knew it was you. Think about that. Fetch's throat moved. Yes, sir, he said, very quietly. Hale walked into his office and closed the door. He sat down at his desk and looked at the stack of work waiting for him, and for a moment did not touch it. He thought about a 16-year-old girl walking into a room and catching a 7mm discrepancy. He thought about a 19-year-old alone in a place with no name, doing something impossible and coming home and not telling anyone. He thought about the gong ringing at 2 miles in the cold mountain air and the silence that followed it, and the way that silence had felt, not empty but full, the way silences are when something true has just been demonstrated without a single word. I thought about the institution he had served for 32 years, about what it asked of people and what it gave back, and the gap between those two things, which was sometimes small and sometimes enormous, and which most of the time went unexamined, because examining it too closely was uncomfortable, and comfort was always easier than honesty. I thought about the call he had made to Virginia, about Caldwell saying he'd make some calls, about the slow grinding machinery of institutional change and how long it took and how many people it ran over on its way to arriving somewhere better. He thought about Mara Knox in the armory, pen in hand, correcting 3 years of wrong documentation with the same unhurried precision she brought to a 2-mile shot. He picked up a pen and opened the report Fetch had prepared. He worked until 1900 hours. Then he stopped and sat in the quiet of his office and made one more call. This one was not to Virginia, and not to Wentworth, and not to Greer. This one was to his wife in Maryland. She answered on the second ring and said his name in the warm, specific way that 26 years of marriage produces, a way of saying a name that carries an entire shared history in 2 syllables. "Hey," he said. "Hey yourself, you sound different." He almost smiled. Different. Same word Mara's mother had used. "Something happened today," he said. "A couple of days, actually. I can't tell you what." "I know," she said. She always said that. She had learned to say it the way Mara's mother had learned to hold the not knowing. Because some people were built to love soldiers, and loving soldiers meant loving them around the silence. "I just wanted to hear your voice," he said. "Then listen," she said. She told him about the day. Small things. The neighbor's dog had gotten into the garden again. She had finally finished the book she'd been reading for 2 months. Their daughter had called from Portland with news that she was being considered for a promotion. Small, ordinary, real things, the texture of a life lived in the visible world, while someone you loved moved through the invisible one. He listened. He listened to all of it. When they hung up 20 minutes later, he sat for another moment in the quiet of the office. Then he stood, put on his cover, and walked out into the night. The base was quieter now. The motor pool, the administrative buildings, the training areas, all winding down toward lights out. He walked without any specific destination, just walking the way he sometimes walked to let his mind settle after a long day. He passed Armory Building 7. The light was still on inside. He stopped. He almost walked on. But he stopped, and he stood outside the building for a moment, and through the high window he could see the movement of a figure inside, small, precise, unhurried, still working, still documenting, still making sure the record was right, even the records that no one would see, even the records that existed only because someone had decided they should. I did not go in. She did not need him to go in. She was not in there waiting to be seen. She was in there because the work needed doing, and she was the one doing it, and that was reason enough. He stood outside for a moment longer. Then he turned and walked back toward the main building, and his footsteps had a different quality than they had yesterday morning. Not slower, not less, sure, but different in the way that footsteps are different when the ground under them has shifted and the person walking has finally noticed. In Armory 7, Mara Knox set her pen down at 2000 hours. She capped it and set it beside the clipboard and looked at what she had completed. 2 full sections of inventory, properly documented, correctly cataloged, cross-referenced, and annotated in the way they should have been for the past 3 years and hadn't been. She looked at the M82A1 in its rack. New scope mount, properly torqued, 0 tolerance deviation, ready. She looked at the matte black badge on her sleeve. 3,200 meters, confirmed. A number that lived in a file no one could open, attached to a name that officially occupied a space between existing and not existing, awarded for a moment of absolute precision in a place with no name on a day that had no official record. She thought about what Voss had said on the phone. Extraordinary with decency. That's something worth protecting. She thought about her mother's voice on the phone. You have always mattered, even when nobody knew. She thought about the gong ringing at 2 miles, clean and clear and absolute. She picked up the clipboard and made the final entry for the day. Date, time, items, documented, technician, signature. She signed it the way she signed everything, clearly without flourish, because the point was the record, not the signature. She put the clipboard on the proper hook. She turned off the light. She walked out into the night, and the mountains stood around the base in the dark, enormous and indifferent and permanent, and Mara Knox walked through them toward her quarters with the stride of someone who has found the answer to a question she had not known she was carrying. She was not invisible because she was unimportant. She was unknown because what she did was too important to risk with visibility. There was a difference. There had always been a difference. She had always known it intellectually. She was beginning finally to feel it. She went to her quarters. She opened the notebook. She finished the letter to her mother. All at this time, not the careful filtered version she usually managed, but the real one. The one that said, I am okay. The one that said, people saw me this week and treated it like it mattered. The one that said, I think of you in the middle of all of it every time, And that thought is one of the things that keeps my hand steady. She folded it. She did not address it. She put it with the others in the small box under her bunk, the unsent letters, the ones that existed because some truths needed to be written even if they couldn't travel. She lay down. She looked at the ceiling. Outside, the mountains kept their silence, and the base settled into the particular piece of a place where hard work had been done and the day was finished. And somewhere 2 miles north on a ridgeline, a 12-inch steel gong sat in the dark, still and solid, bearing on its surface the mark of something that had traveled an impossible distance with absolute precision and landed exactly where it was aimed. Some things did not need to be celebrated to be real. Some people did not need to be known to matter. Mara Knox closed her eyes and her breathing slowed, and she slept the deep, untroubled sleep of someone who has done the right thing in the right way and knows it down in the place where no rank and no classification and no blacked out file can reach down, where the truth lives unedited and permanent and entirely completely her own.